Hello, my name is Floyd Shimomura, and I'm at the Winters Museum. And today is January 7th, 2025. I was involved in putting together an exhibit for the Winters Museum talking about the Japanese American community. They used to live here in Winters, but no longer exist at this time. And this museum exhibit is designed to show what the Japanese American community was like in the pre-war period and the great contributions that it made to the city of Winters and this area, and the reason why that community has disappeared in the post-World War II period. Like I said, my name is Floyd Shimomura, and I grew up in Winters and graduated from Winters High School in 1966. And right here is a picture of me when I was in high school, and I was elected Youth Day Mayor, which in this town at that time was, I felt quite an honor. And this photograph shows me with my appointed city council. That was the year that I graduated from high school. And then I went on to UC Davis as an undergraduate, and then went to law school there and graduated from law school in 1973. And during that period of time, in constitutional law, we studied about civil rights and due process of law. And we never really talked about the Japanese American experience at that time. And that was something that I was always very curious about. So after I graduated from law school, I joined the Japanese American Citizens League in Sacramento, because at that time I was working for the state of California as a deputy attorney general. And so I became active in that chapter and became chapter president in 1976. And during that time, I learned a lot about what really happened during World War II in this area. And I got interested in the whole internment experience and the things that happened during that point in time. And I got involved in a movement called the Japanese American Redress Movement to get compensation for Japanese Americans that were interned and incarcerated during World War II. And I became so involved in that I became national president in 1982 through 1984. And during that time, I was Sansei, and there's an article here that says that Floyd Shimomura becomes first Sansei JCL national president. Now, Sansei means third generation, and up until that time, all the national presidents had been second generation or Nisei. And here's a picture of me when I was national president. And during that time, I helped testify before a federal commission that investigated the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. And I testified at that hearing, and there's a picture of me here doing that. Also, I testified before Congress and advocated for redress, me doing that. And I also visited the White House, the West Wing of the White House, to talk to this issue with Ronald Reagan's um, domestic policy advisor who was in charge of legislation. His name was Jack Spahn, and urged him to talk to the president about supporting our bill. I also traveled to Tokyo and met with Prime Minister Nakasone and talked to him about this issue. And it just so happened that Ronald Reagan was going to visit Japan, and he was going to be the first president of the United States to ever address the Japanese Parliament. And while he was there for a few days, he was going to stay at the Japanese White House. And Prime Minister Nakasone told me about that, and he asked me if there was anything that I wanted him to say to President Reagan. And I told Prime Minister Nakasone that he should ask President Reagan to sign our Japanese American redress bills. And the Prime Minister grunted and kind of nodded in an ambiguous way that could either mean I understand or I agree, and I never quite knew for sure which one he meant. But as it turned out, 4 years later, Ronald Reagan did sign the redress bill, and 10 years after Ronald Reagan left the White House, his legislative papers became public, and there's indication and documents that show that the Nakasone administration lobbied the president for 3 or 4 months in the period after I met with the Prime Minister, trying to get him to sign the bill. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of people who talked to the president about that bill, so I'm not sure what impact Mr. Nakasone's comments had, but I like to think that it could have helped a little bit in getting this bill passed. I guess the final thing in this exhibit, it shows a picture of me in Washington, D.C. in front of the Smithsonian, where my papers from the redress period are now have been collected and preserved for scholars to study in the future, and also there are photographs of autographed copies of the original redress bills that were signed by Senator Inoue of Hawaii, Senator Spark Matsunaga of Hawaii, and the House bill by Norma Mineta and by Bob Matsui. And there are some nice little notes that they wrote on it. And that bill was something that the Smithsonian wanted to keep and preserve, and it's very unique. I think that's the only document that of that nature that is in existence, and it was given to me when I was leaving office as National JCL President as a gift and a kind of a thank you, I think. So I guess this is a long way of kind of saying that I've been involved in this issue, and really that's the reason why I've been very involved in this current exhibit that we have in Winters, because it really shows that the community of Winters has been involved with the whole Japanese American experience, particularly in California agriculture, right from the inception. And I hope as we go through the exhibit, we can show what great contributions the Winters Japanese community made for over 100 years, from 1888, when the first Japanese arrived in Winters, till 1988, when Ronald Reagan signed the redress bill. Well, I'm going to start by talking about the first settlers in Winters. And there was a book written by Yuji Ichioka that actually mentions Winters. And he really wrote something that really surprised me. He wrote, quote, "The Japanese entered California agriculture in 1888 when a few student laborers worked as field hands in Winters near Vacaville." So just think about that a second. Our little town of Winters, which is about 70 miles northeast of San Francisco, really was the first place where the Japanese are recorded to have started working in California agriculture. And I read that, so I did some research on how did that happen. And what I learned was that there's an article written in 1888 in the Winters Express that talked about the Brink brothers and also Mr. Thistle, who at that time, they lived up in Pleasant Valley. And the Brink brothers were worried that the farmhands that they used to run their orchards and also to pick the apricots and peaches, that they were going to have a problem with getting enough labor, because in 1892 Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which cut off further immigration from China. And at that time, the Chinese were probably the major labor force in this area. And by 1888, 6 years after the Exclusion Act, I think they felt that gradually they were seeing that the Chinese were starting to move on to other professions and areas other than agriculture, and they were worried that they wouldn't have enough workers. So this article says that in order to remedy that, they decided to recruit Japanese students from San Francisco to help supplement their labor needs during harvest season. And that's really how the first Japanese came to Winters. They were student laborers. Most of them lived in San Francisco, and they had come from Japan really to learn English, learn more about American technology and society. And so they would cook meals, clean the house, do other domestic chores. But then in the afternoons, they would take classes to learn more about the United States and to learn English. But during the summertime, they would take a vacation and try and earn some extra money. And it's my belief that part of their job was to go down to the produce market in San Francisco, which also was dominated by the Chinese at that time. And they learned about part-time jobs that they can get out in a place called Vacaville and Winters in May, June, July, and summer months, where they can earn some extra money. And this was the pool of people that the Brink brothers organized and brought to Winters, and that started in 1888. and would actually continue on all the way up until World War II, this practice. So, but these student laborers only came for a few weeks or months during the summer months, and they were just part-time laborers during harvest season. I did some research to find out who some of these students were and whether any of these students actually ended up staying and putting roots down in Winters itself. And what I learned was that there was a person named Iwagusu Takahashi who, according to records, came to the United States in 1892 or 1893, and he ended up working for the Brink brothers. Okay, and here's a photograph taken in 1907, and this person here is Iwagusu Takahashi, and he took the name of George. And George became a supervisor or manager on the Brink Brothers farm, and we know that he probably came originally as a student, because the census in 1990 shows that he could speak, read, and write English, which was an extraordinary thing at that point in time. But this language ability made him very useful to the Brink brothers, because he could speak with the brothers and find out what they wanted, and he could help recruit and pass instructions on to the Japanese workers. So this picture shows him with the Brink brothers, and this picture was taken in 1907, and we know that because there's a telephone pole back here, and electricity and telephone service came to Winters around 1904 and 1905, that period of time. So, this picture has, and there's also a picture of George Takahashi with his wife Asano, which also was extraordinary, because at that point in time, almost all of the Japanese that came here were young men, ages anywhere from 18 to maybe 30 years old. Most of them around 20, 22 years old, because originally they were college students, right, when they first came here. And what happened in 1907 is that the same kind of anti-Asian feeling that led to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1892 cropped up again, and there was a big push to stop immigration from Japan. And the Brink brothers were well aware of that, because they had anticipated, they had seen what happened under the Chinese Exclusion Act, and so it's my belief that they took this photograph, and here are the Brink brothers and their wives and children standing in front of the horse and wagon that they used in 1907. And I think the picture was taken in June, because you can see the apricots drying in the background. And then we know that Asano went back to Japan in December of 1907 and had her son, which is this person up here. This photograph was taken in about 1924, and And so we know that Asano went back to Japan, and they used this photograph as a recruiting tool, because this original photograph actually came from the Takahashi family. And I think what they were trying to depict was not only were there jobs for young Japanese men, but there was also a role to be played by Japanese women in terms of caring for the younger children of the owners, and probably doing cooking and other domestic chores for the growers. So this is, you can tell what the state of the agriculture was at this point in time. And actually my grandfather came here in 1906, so this was the state of the agriculture. Very basic, no trucks, no tractors, still horse and human labor. Now when Asano went back to Japan, she went back to a place called Wakayama, which is kind of between Osaka and Tokyo. And her village was about maybe 5 miles from Wakayama Castle. And Wakayama was the in the early days part of the Tokugawa family's home province. I think they had 3 main domains, and Wakayama was one of them. And after the Tokugawas were taken out of power in 1868, and new people came in, a lot of the people from Wakayama, which used to be in power, now were being replaced by the new government. And that may have been one of the reasons why so many people from Wakayama came to Winters, because at one time they were on top, but now they were on the bottom. Also in this corner, we have a picture of Hiroshi Matsumoto. He also was from Wakayama and a member of the early Winters community. And here's another picture of the Matsumoto family. And he was very active in the Buddhist church in Winters, and they have even named a street for him in the town of Winters in the post-World War II era. As I said, this photograph was taken in 1907 because the Brink brothers were thinking about using it as a recruiting picture. And the reason why they were was that in 1907, the so-called gentleman's agreement was entered into between Japan and the United States that halted further Japanese immigration by young males. So in a way, it was very much like the Chinese Exclusion Act, but there was an exception, okay, and that was that for the young Japanese men who were already here, if they had a wife and family, they could bring their wife and family here. So that was a exception and loophole. Now, and that's one of the primary reasons why this photograph was taken, because the Brink brothers probably felt that they wanted to retain the workers that they already had, and the way to retain them was to have them bring their family and wives over. to Winters to help with the agriculture here in the Winters area. And that leads us to these photographs right here, which were taken in 1930. And you can see that in 1930, this is about 23 years after the Exclusion Act went into effect. And you can see that in Winters, the community had just opened their new Japanese school. And you can see all the children here standing in front of it. So you can see, at least in Winters, this recruiting attempt was very successful in terms of attracting more Japanese women from Wakayama and those villages to come out to Winters. You may have heard about the Japanese picture brides, and during the 1900s, 1907 to 1920 or so, many picture brides came from Wakayama to Winters. And by 1930, you can see the results of that activity. Now, when you look at this picture, one question that you might have to ask yourself is how were the Japanese able to buy this property in Winters to erect this building? And the answer is that, and the reason why there's a question is that the Japanese were prohibited from owning land under the Alien Land Law during this period of time. So how were they able to buy the land to do that? And the answer is quite simple, is that some of the first babies that were born after 1907 were born in 1909, 1910. And by this period of time, 1929, 1930, these first babies turned 21 years old. And they were American citizens by birth, but now they're old enough to actually utilize the American legal system in terms of incorporation, and that's what they did. And so the whole restriction on Japanese land ownership as a restriction really began to be overcome, you might say, by 1930. And I think this picture shows how effective the Brink brothers were in terms of recruiting people to come to Winters. Also during, this picture was also taken in 1930, and this is a picture of Japantown. And Japantown was located right to the north east of the Winters Railroad Bridge. Okay, and you can see that out in the corner. And this picture depicts a funeral that took place in 1930, and there's approximately 150 people in this photograph. Probably 90% of whom are adults. So if you look at these two pictures together, the top picture, the funeral picture, shows most of the adult population of Winters at that time, and the bottom picture shows a lot of the children at that time. And statistically at that time, there were about 300 Japanese who lived permanently in the Winters area, and which was a significant portion of the population, since the Winters area had only a population of about 1,200. So, so about a fourth of the population of Winters in 1930, during the 1930s, were Japanese. You also have to remember or know that during harvest season, many Japanese who lived in Sacramento and some in the Bay Area would come out to Winters to help with the harvest. So the Japanese community would almost double for maybe 2 months out of the year, to maybe 600 or so during harvest season. So the Japanese in the pre-World War II period were a very significant part of the Winters community and played a foundational role in the agriculture during that period of time. Well, we were talking about the Japantown in Winters and how it was near the railroad bridge. And you can see that Japantown consisted of kind of a big grocery general store called Harai, and also it had a small Japanese Buddhist temple right here in the middle, where the coffin is in front of, and then to the left of the Buddhist temple is a fish store, and there's a sign there that says "Fresh fish today," and it would list what the fresh fish was. I think they used a little blackboard type of concept. And then in back of these buildings are well, you can also see a boarding house to the far left, but in back of these buildings there were cottages. Now, one of the sad stories about Japantown is that at the end of World War II, right when the Japanese surrendered on VJ Day in 1945, everybody was so happy in the United States that there was big celebrations all over New York City, San Francisco. But even in Winters, there was a big celebration on Main Street. And unfortunately, something got out of hand, and that evening, Japantown was burnt down. Which was kind of a tragedy, because that was exactly the same time when the internment incarceration camps were closing. And so the people in the camps had to decide whether they would return to Winters or go someplace else, like Sacramento or San Francisco or Los Angeles. Some even went to Chicago or back east to New Jersey. And you know, the word got out that it wasn't safe to come back to Winters, and so only about 15% of the people were able to come back. And so out of 300 or so permanent Japanese residents, only about 15% came back, which is like less than 50. And fortunately, my family was one that was able to come back, and that's why I was able to go to Winters High School and participate in putting this exhibit together. The other thing about Japantown was that this hostility towards Japanese, it wasn't a thing that just happened during World War II. Is that in 1915, the Winters Town Council passed an ordinance which turned Winters into a segregated community where Japanese were only allowed to do business or to live in one small area of Winters, which is basically Rotary Park now, that area, and which is where Japantown was. Other than that, they weren't allowed to work or live anywhere else. Now, fortunately, most of the Japanese did not live in Winters. They lived on farms around Winters, but a significant percentage of the people did live in Winters, and they were confined to this one small area. Finally, the exhibit also has some photographs from the monument that was placed in Rotary Park, which actually duplicates this photograph that we have on the wall here. And here's a picture of it. It tells the story of the Japanese in Winters in summary form, and it reminds people that at one time the Japantown was really a very vibrant part of the Winters community. And here's a photograph from the ceremony, and this is a picture of my aunt, named Harumi March. But her maiden name is Harumi Shimomura, and she was the oldest living person who remains, whose picture is in this 1930 photograph. I know it's a little bit small, but there she is right there. She was like 3 or 4 years old, and she's being held by my grandmother, Samano Shimomura. But there still are some remnants of the community in existence in Winters, besides this monument that we just put up in May 2024. If you go to the Winters Cemetery, there is a large monument that was erected around 1974, I believe, to honor the pioneer Issei, and this was put up by the Buddhist Church. And there were many tombstones, and there's even an older part of the Winters Museum that, Winters Cemetery, where the pre-World War II Japanese who passed away are buried. Sadly, when you go out and look at those tombstones, many of them were babies who died at childbirth. The date of death and the date of birth are actually the same. But one of the most prominent tombstones is of George Takahashi, who passed away in 1934, and it is very close to the Brink brothers' very large family cemetery area that they have there. In fact, they're only about 20 feet apart, and which really shows the close relationship that that the Takahashi family had with the Brink family. And among the earliest tombstones, there's one that the earliest one is 1892. So, you know, the first Japanese came in 1888, so that's only about 4 years later. And it indicated that that person was 31 years old. So there's still a lot of research and work to be done in terms of putting all the pieces together. But I think we have a pretty good overview of this period of time. But our museum exhibit has a lot more things about World War II, which we'll be covering in a second or two. You know, while Winters was a segregated community since 1915, that didn't necessarily mean that people didn't get along. And here, one example is of the Horai general merchandise store that we saw in Japantown. Now, that was kind of a grocery store, plus it had kind of a hardware store. If you needed a shovel or a loaf of bread, you went there and you can get it. And here's a picture of Mr. Charlie Hamakawa, who was the person who ran that store, and his family. And you can see in the background in this photograph here, it says Horai Company General Merchandise. And this picture was taken in the 1930s, and this is a picture of Charlie's wife. And so you can see a little more close-up view of what the Horai Company store looked like. But my father told me that Charlie used to work very closely with the Vasey brothers, who also had a grocery store on Main Street. And they would cooperate in terms of going to Sacramento to buy things for their store, because if they pooled their resources, they can get a better price. Plus, it was easier to make one trip and bring all the stuff into Winters at one time. And it also meant that the inventory that they had at both stores were somewhat similar, so that in terms of pricing and what was available was coordinated. So even in a segregated community, there was great cooperation and on both the business and on the farming end. It's just that each group had their own role in the community, and as long as you stayed in that role, everything was fine. And there were many very great friendships that developed even in that context. I think sometimes we get the view that if a community is segregated, the people just scowl at each other, but that really isn't the case. At least that wasn't the case in Winters. But let me talk a moment about my own family. As I said, my grandfather came in 1906, just before they shut off immigration in 1907 for young Japanese coming from Japan. And so he was one of the last of the original pre-1907 Issei who came to Winters. So when he arrived in 1906, actually the community had been there for almost 20 years before he even arrived. So you can see how deep and long the roots are in that community. And ironically, if you look at the railroad bridge, the new steel bridge that they erected in 1906, and I think they opened it in 1907, you can see the top beams all have 1906 written on them, so it's easy for me to remember when my grandfather came. And I kind of like to think that when he came in on the train, he came to a nice new community at that time that was booming. Okay, but so here's a picture of my grandfather up there at the top, and his wife Sawano, who's my grandmother, and my father Ben, and my grandmother's sister Kimiyo. She went back to Japan in 1933, all right? And the reason why we have that picture of the Japanese school is because she brought that picture back with her at that time and preserved it during World War II. And it wasn't until in the 1980s when my father and mother visited Kimiyo in Wakayama that that picture was returned back to Winters. And because that picture showed both the American flag and the Japanese flag, many of the or almost all the copies that we're aware of were destroyed after World War II because the Japanese were afraid that the FBI would abuse a photograph like that. Anything that had to do with Japan as being showing disloyalty. So, that photograph survived because of that kind of historical quirk. And this is the picture of my great-grandfather. His name was Uenishi, Toyokichi Uenishi, and he ran a little boarding house at the corner of Railroad Avenue and Abbey, and it was right across the street from the train station, and he sadly ended up having to give up running that boarding house. Now, he didn't own it because Japanese couldn't own property, but he kind of managed it and was kind of like a quasi-lessor of that boarding house. But he had to leave that task after 1915 because that location, even though it was only 1 block away from Japantown, did not fall within the 1 block restriction. Now, ironically, when my grandfather first came to Winters in 1906, he probably stayed at his father-in-law's boarding house across the street, at least initially, not knowing at that time that he would become his father-in-law. And because my grandmother came to Winters in 1912, okay, a few years later, and then ultimately he ended up marrying the boarding house manager's daughter. So that's kind of a part of our family history about how that worked out. So my grandmother actually was not a picture bride per se, because she came here as a single unmarried woman and then got married here in the United States. So her story is a little bit different than most of the picture brides that got married during that period of time. And here is a picture of my grandmother, Sawano, on the far right. And that's her mother, who came to Winters for a few years and then went back to Japan in 1918, but tragically fell ill and died during her return to Japan. While the children in the Japanese community during the 1930s did go to the Japanese school on Saturdays, just like all the other kids, they went to public schools during the regular week. And in Winters, at the grammar school level, they had country schools in the area around Winters. And here's a photograph of the country school in the area that my dad grew up in, out west of Winters. And here it was a one-room school, had about 40 kids in it. And I think what is significant is that it shows kind of how large the Japanese community was at that time during the 1930s, where about a third of the students at the Apricot School were of Japanese ancestry, about a third were of Spanish ancestry, and about a third were native Californians who had grown up in this area. So the public school system really was a great integrating force in the community in terms of bringing the younger people together. And it did turn out later on that in the post-World War II era, that really helped the integration of the small number of Japanese who were able to return to integrate into the community, because they had actually gone to school with many of the people around their own age in the pre-World War II era. And besides the Apricot School, there's a picture of the Olive School and the picture of Wolfskill School, and you can see the same basic demographic difference in terms of about a third of the students being of Japanese ancestry. The other thing I wanted to mention up here is the Hiramatsu family. They also are a family that have lived in Winters for a very long time. And I wanted to point out in particular Roy Hiramatsu. You can see in this picture that he served during World War II in the military intelligence service, because he had learned Japanese growing up and could read and write Japanese. And so during World War II, he spent a lot of time in the Pacific Theater translating intercepted documents and also interviewing captured Japanese soldiers. So one of the other ironies is that when the war started, many people felt that the Japanese might be spies for Japan, but as it ended up, Roy became a spy for the United States, you might say, in terms of intercepting Japanese military messages and translating them into English so that the American commanders would know what the Japanese were up to. And he was a very good friend of my father, and also he had two sons. He also had a daughter, not pictured, and named Ron and Dennis. And Dennis Hiramatsu, after he graduated from Winters High School, went to dental school and returned to Winters and was a dentist here until he retired just a few years ago. So he really is one of the longest living persons of Japanese ancestry who can trace his lineage back to pre-1907 period of time. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the entire United States, including Winters area, people were just in an absolute uproar and panic, many thinking that the Japanese might invade the west coast of the United States. And at that time, big public outpouring of resentment against the Japanese living in the Winters area, as well as all up and down the west coast, occurred. And many of them wanted the Japanese to be moved out of California. And in response to that public outcry, the whole west coast of the United States was put under military occupation, you might say. And that allowed the government, under Executive Order 9066, issued by the President, to take extraordinary steps on the West Coast that ordinarily, they could not do. And that impacted Yolo County. And in our exhibit, we have a copy of Civilian Exclusion Order number 78 that applied to Yolo County, and it required that all persons of Japanese ancestry had to leave Yolo County by May 21st, 1942, and they were only given about a week's notice, and about 4 days before they were required to leave, people were required to register in Woodland and register their family and get a family registration number. And on this trunk here, you can see the family registration number for my family, Shimomura family, 30980. And my father remembers driving down to Woodland and going to the American Legion Post building where the government gave him that number. And at the time, he didn't know how significant that number was, because the next 4 years of his life was governed by that number. They were required to report to the Woodland train station on May 21st, and they were called up by number. So depending on what your number was, determined what seat you would have on the train. And then when they were taken to an assembly center in Merced, and the Merced Fairgrounds, and the horse stall that you were assigned were also assigned by a number, according to the one that you received, that we received in Woodland. So as it turned out, same thing happened when they were then moved to Colorado in Amachi, is that the assignments were done by number. So depending on who you happened to be standing next to in line when you got your number, ended up being your neighbor and train mate for the next three and a half years. So that was a significant event. And in our exhibit, we do show where the various, in incarceration camps were. Most of them were in Colorado, Arizona, Nevada, places like that. In the Winters area, the people who lived in Yolo County, north of Butte Creek, went to Colorado, to Amachi. That's where my family went. But those who lived in Solano County, south of Butte Creek, were sent to Gila River. So during World War II, the Winters Japanese community was really divided in half, because roughly half the community lived north and half south of Butte Creek. One sad story that I just learned recently was that when people were reporting to the train station in Woodland, they had to pack all their stuff up, and they can only take what they could carry. So 6 families got together, and they had a truck that they loaded up to take their things to Woodland. But that night, somebody broke in and set that truck on fire, and it burned everything up. That's something that I just learned about 2 or 3 months ago. So there was a lot of hostility at that time. After the people left in May of 1942 and were sent to the camps, something happened in Winters that was very unusual. That in January of 1943, about 8 months after people had been basically banished from Winters, Winters High School burnt down. And there was an article here in the Winters Express that talked about that. And what the article said was that, January, that's the middle of the school year, and so the school district was in a panic mode because they need to have some place to continue their high school program. So what they decided was that they would take over the Japanese school, which was located about maybe 2 blocks east of the high school, and use that as a temporary Winters High School headquarters, and they used a few other places in town. But they renamed the Japanese school Victory High School, and I'm not sure what the reasoning was behind that, but I guess they felt a little uncomfortable occupying that building, and they didn't want to call it the Japanese school. Anyway, in order to use the Japanese school, they had to do one thing, because the Japanese school was at that time being used as a storage facility, because people who were interned could only take what they can carry. So most people, like my family, they would have big trunks like this where they would store some of the things they wanted to save. And they stored them in the Japanese school. So before they could use the Japanese school for the new Winters High School, or temporary Winters High School, they had to somehow clear all these things out of the Japanese school. So what they decided to do was to send these things to the camps, to where the people were being interned. So this number here, number 30980, written in black, was written by someone from the school district, and it was sent to my parents in Colorado. I remember talking to my dad about a Winters High School burning down, because he never talked about this when I was growing up. And I asked him if he even if he heard about that. And he says, yeah, I heard about that. We read about it in the Winter's Express. And I said, well, what did you think? And he looked at me and he said, well, he said, the only thing I thought was, well, I guess they can't blame that one on us. And I thought to myself, well, I guess if you're 1,000 miles behind barbed wire fence, you have a pretty good alibi. So, but I also said, well, you know, I heard that they sent all your belongings that you left at the Japanese school to the camp. So weren't you happy when you got your trunk? Because, you know, school district paid for it. And he said, well, it was kind of disappointing because it was basically useless. And I said, why is that? And he says, well, what was in the trunk, one thing was that my grandma had put in some of her fine dishes and things like that, and some pots and pans and other cooking things, because, you know, she was actually hoping or expecting to return home, and she wanted to have some things. And he said, but in the camps we had to eat at the mess hall, so there was no need for dishes or pots and pans. And he said the other thing was we had some very nice dresses and Japanese dresses called kimonos that my grandmother wanted to save, as well as a nice suit that my grandfather had. But he said there wasn't any fancy place to wear these clothes when you're in camp, and if you did wear a nice kimono or fancy suit, people would just laugh at you. So in the end, he said the things that were in it just took up space in the little room that they had been allocated, but really was of no practical use to them at that point. But he said, but the most significant thing was, he said, it made me feel sad when we got that, because it made me feel like that we would never return, that we weren't welcome in Winters anymore. And I thought about that a second, and I thought to myself, well, why would that be so? And then it occurred to me that, you know, it might kind of be like when you leave home and you go to college and you leave some stuff in your room, and but a couple of months later you open up your dorm room and there you see all your stuff piled up outside your door, that all of a sudden you think that home isn't home anymore. And I think that's exactly the feeling that my father had. And I think that also added to the reason why many people did not return after the war, because it wasn't simply the burning down of Japantown, but also people had all their belongings sent to them in the camps. There are a couple pictures of my family in camp, and here's a picture of my father, and I asked him about camp life, and he said mostly it was pretty boring, you know. I mean, they all had jobs, but you know, there wasn't anything really to do, but his job was, he worked in the motor pool, so he got to drive a truck, and he went out to the train station, picked stuff up, and he brought it to the camp, and they put it in warehouses, and then they had food and things, and he would have to pick things up and make deliveries in the camp. That was part of his job. And part of the motor pool they had a dispatch office, okay, where they would go and they would get their instructions on what they were supposed to do that day. And it was at the dispatch office that he met his future wife. And her picture is right there. Her name was Lois Morimoto at the time, and she was from the Turlock area. And they ended up dating and then getting married in Denver, Colorado, a few months before the camp formally closed down. And here's the picture of their wedding picture. And you know, most people have a nice wedding picture and they're standing in a church and there's nice background and everything, and so they had their picture in a parking lot. So, but I'm sure that to them they were still very happy. So it was better than being in a internment camp. In camp, my dad said that they had a lot of time on their hands, so a lot of time. It was very boring. But my dad is not an artist, and his new father-in-law, however, was an artist and very good at making things out of wood. And one of the things that his father-in-law did was he made this vase here out of this little stump of a small tree that he varnished, and really it looks a lot better when there's flowers coming out of the top, but it's composed of two pieces. The top is the vase, and the bottom is a stand that stands on top of it. And here's the picture of the artist right here, and his name was Mr. Shochiguchi, and you know, I really don't remember what his first name is, but I always called him Mr. Shochiguchi. But he was very good at working with wood, and he made this and gave this to my mother, and this was really my mother's stepfather, and my mother's natural father died about a month or two before she was born, and so she never knew her natural father, and so and she was the youngest of the children in the family, so she bonded with the stepfather, and I think that she was always his favorite because he gave her this as a keepsake. And I think the story is that when you're in camp, at least in the early days, people were afraid to do anything that showed anything about Japan or that heritage, because it would be viewed as being disloyal. But her stepfather grew up in Japan before he came to the United States, and it's believed that this actually represents Mount Fuji in his eyes, and it's not that apparent when you just look at the base, but when you put it in a certain way on the base from a certain angle, it does look a little bit like Mount Fuji. So this was an artist's way of not only being creative, but also a way of him remembering his homeland. Another thing that happened during World War II was the role that Japanese Americans played in the United States military. And that story played out in winters just as it did in all other Japanese American communities, and it created a great tension and discussion about what they should do. Many felt that in order to prove their loyalty, they wanted to prove their loyalty by going into the army and fighting for the United States. And others said, well, why should we do that when they're putting us in these concentration camps and our families are locked up? We're just not going to do anything. We're not going to cooperate in that way. And in winters, that played out in the Kato family in particular. Mike Kato and Pete Kato, they both also went to Winters High School and graduated. And Pete actually had enlisted in the military before Pearl Harbor, so he already was in the military. And Mike joined later on. Initially, they did not want the Japanese in the military because their loyalty was suspect. But as the war wore on, I think they became more convinced that maybe the Japanese could be useful in the war because the army needed more soldiers. And so they created a special combat team composed entirely of Japanese Americans, the 442nd Combat Team, and that was composed of not only the 442nd, which was the Americans that lived in the continental United States, and also the 100th Infantry Battalion, which was composed of Hawaiian Japanese Americans. And together they formed a special unit that was sent to Europe to fight against the Germans. This combined unit had about 4,000 soldiers in it when it was fully manned, and it fought in Italy and in France and all the way up into Germany, where one of the units ironically liberated one of the German death camps. And that was a story that really was not well known until long after World War II. But out of the 4,000, 14,000 Japanese American boys served in that unit. And for a unit that only existed for about 2.5 years, that's a turnover rate of, what, 3.5 times. So you can see how high the casualty rates were taken by the 442nd and 100th. Not all of them were killed, of course, but for every soldier that dies, there's usually 10 to 15 that are injured or get sick, or a battlefield is a dangerous place, so there's lots of ways of getting injured. But I think most historians today would say that many of the generals that oversaw the 442nd and 100th used them as shock troops in Europe and sent them on the most dangerous missions, and that's why the casualty rates were so high. But the Nisei soldiers that I met were all very proud of their service, and they never complained or that they were shock troops. In fact, I think if you told them that, they might probably punch you in the face, because they wanted to be regarded as heroes, all right, not as chumps that were used by the U.S. Army. But I think there was a lot of truth to both of it. They were heroes, but I think that they were, the statistics showed that the casualty rates that they took were unusually high. But not everyone was like Mike and Pete, or who went to Europe and fought against the Germans, or like Hiromatsu, who was in military intelligence that decoded Japanese military messages. Some people, some of the young men, they're called no-no boys, refused to join the army or participate in any way to support the United States government. And they got the name no-no boys because there was a questionnaire that was circulated, and two of the questions right together, they basically asked, are you willing to serve in the United States military, and do you disclaim all loyalty to the government of Japan? And most of the Nisei answered that they would, yes, that they were loyal to the United States, and yes, they would disclaim. But there were some that said no, they refused to do that. And those people were taken out of the 10-boat normal camps and put in Tule Lake, which became this famous, infamous, you might say, segregated camp. That camp was located, in Tule Lake, California, and had extra barbed wire, and even had a special military unit with tanks around the borders, because all the no-no were sent to that particular camp. Ironically, when I was president of the Sacramento chapter of the JACL, that originally Sacramento was one of the major cities that populated Tule Lake, but when they did the conversion, many of them got scattered to other camps. They were quote loyals, and but the connotation is that if you spent time at Tule Lake, then you were disloyal or no-no. So I can imagine within the Kato family itself that this conflict about whether you're going to be yes or no was quite a traumatic decision that was made. And this box here was for Jihei Takamoto, which is related to the Kato family, and this was used to transfer his belongings from Gila River to Tule Lake. Gila River being the camp that people from Solano County were taken to during World War II. But despite all these casualties, the 442nd and 100th has been recognized as one of the most highly decorated units in American history. And this one particular battle where 442nd and Hunters rescued this Texas unit. They had 200 Texans were trapped by the Germans in this mountainous area between France and Germany, and they had repeatedly tried to rescue them, but none of the units, the regular army units, could do it. So they sent the 442nd in, and I think over 5 days of fighting, day and night, the 442nd and Hunters were able to liberate the Texas so-called Lost Battalion, and they rescued the 200 Texans. But the cost of that was enormous. The Japanese soldiers took almost 900 casualties and about 112 dead to rescue 20 Texans, or 200 Texans. So even in military terms, that's not a good trade-off. But I know a lot about that story because that Texas battalion that was rescued during the redress period, they were big supporters of redress, and that Texas unit came from the same congressional area that Jim Wright, Congressman Jim Wright, who at that time was the Speaker of the House, that unit was right from his district. So during the redress campaign, Jim Wright was a big supporter of Japanese-American redress, and a lot of it had to do with the fact of the great sacrifices that the Japanese Americans did. So again, the world works in strange ways, but all the casualties and deaths that the 442nd and 100th they incurred, in the end, did a lot to help the Japanese American redress movement, particularly in the House, because our redress bill became a speaker's bill. In other words, the speaker supported that and was a co-author, and speaker's bill almost always passed. So that was a great victory and I think vindication for our New City soldiers. I was born in 1948 after the war, and fortunately my family was one of the 15% that was able to return to Winters, and I think it's true for not only myself, for all the families that were able to return, that there was somebody who actually went against public opinion and helped them return. Because not everybody who wanted to return was so fortunate. And in my family's case, our guardian angel was the Tufts family, which was a neighbor to my grandfather and grandmother out on the Horseshoe, which is 2 miles west of Winters. And the Tufts family was very different from the typical Winters farm family, because Professor Warren Tufts, was a pulmonology professor at UC Davis. In fact, he became ultimately the chairman of the pulmonology department there. And as you know, pulmonology has to do with fruit trees and that kind of thing. And so not only was he a professor, but he was involved with the UC Davis experimental farm, just south of Pewter Creek and west of town. And during that period, when there was an organized effort to keep the Japanese out, he and his son, Warren Tufts Jr., kind of went against public opinion and invited our family back to the Horseshoe. And although we couldn't return at that time to our original farm that we had worked on before the war, it was almost right next door. And here's a photograph of the little cottage that we were allowed to live in, and a picture of me when I was 1 year old, and my mother is holding me in front of that little cottage. And after living 3 years in a concentration camp, as modest and small as that little cottage was, I think there was 2 small bedrooms, a small living room, and a kitchen, basically, and in a bathroom. But she thought it was a palace, and she had a kitchen that she could cook in, and but most of all, I think she said that she felt safe because she was right next to the Tufts family home. I mean, it's only maybe 30 feet apart, so she felt that secure being there. Because, see, Dr. Tufts was very well respected in the community because everyone knew he knew a lot about how to grow good apricots and peaches and cherries, so his advice was well heeded. And so even today, I'm very grateful to the Tufts family and their children. And in this thing, in this shelf, we have some pictures from my childhood, growing up on the Horseshoe, and here's a picture of myself when I was in grammar school, and I have my Cub Scout uniform on, and my brother has this band uniform on, and my sisters, one of them has a Japanese kimono and the other one has a cowboy hat on, so we are a true Japanese American family here, those photographs. Also, there's a picture of me on my 10th birthday, and all my Japanese American friends were invited to it, so you can see the Hiramatsu, the Danjote, and James Akao and David Akao. All those families were able to return, and like I said, every one of them told me could tell a story that's very similar to mine about some farmer or who let them come back and welcomed them, even though for a period of time that was not very popular in winters. And sure enough, by the time I became old enough to go to kindergarten, which was 1953 or so, people had pretty much calmed down. They kind of got over it. But on the other hand, looking back on it now, no one really ever talked about the fact that we were there and then we weren't there for 3 or 4 years and then we came back. It's kind of like everyone, my parents and others, just kind of said, we're just looking to the future now, and we're not going to burden the younger generation on all the bad things that had happened here. So there's this one picture here where I'm playing cowboys and robbers, I guess, with was Vicky Tufts. Okay, this is the daughter of Warren Tufts Jr. And we all have our little cowboy outfits on, and I have the chaps and a hat, and I have a little toy gun, and I remember I could spin it on one finger, you know, and then flip it into my holster. So I spent hours perfecting that. But we were still good friends, and my dad ultimately was able to rebuy his the farms that my grandfather used to manage and farm on the Horseshoe Road in about 1951. And the story behind that is that it was actually owned by a person named Jeanette Bassett, but she lived in Baltimore, and she came from a wealthy family, and her family owned property in Iowa and a lot of places. But she corresponded with my father during World War II and kind of kept track of what we were doing. And she always remembered the fact that when her uncle, who lived on the farm, became elderly, that my grandmother and grandfather had provided elder care for cooking for him and giving him a bath and you know, things that go well beyond just caring for the apricot trees that were out there. So so she helped us buy the farm. I think the price was reasonable, but I think the main thing is that before she sold it to us, because my dad said he couldn't afford to even make a down payment, she let him lease the farm for about 3 years under very generous terms, where and the biggest thing was it was kind of like a sharecropper type of thing. But normally a sharecropper has to pay all the labor expenses, you know. You know, landowner provides the land, equipment, and pays property taxes and everything. But she said that she would actually pay 50% of the labor costs, which was probably the biggest single expense that you have when you're an apricot farmer. So he was able to save up enough money to make a down payment based on that. And then agricultural prices skyrocketed during the 50s. And so, you know, after living there about 8 years, the bank they were able to keep refinancing because the price of the farm had doubled, if not tripled, during that period of time. So my dad was very lucky in terms of the real estate market and everything. So it's very fortunate. And that's why I could go to Winters High School and be a successful student. And like I mentioned before, I became East Day mayor. And I think my dad and mom were very proud of me. And I think partly because probably any parent would be, but I didn't understand what the historical background was, but this was kind of beyond what my father had ever believed would be possible, at least in his era. But, you know, he lived on to be 100 years old. Well, actually, he lived to be about 102 years old. And he lived long enough so he actually got to come to see this exhibit. And there's a nice picture of him sitting here with his whole family around him with the winter sign in the background. And I'm going to make a copy of it and give it to the museum. But he also got this special certificate from the Japanese government congratulating him on his 100th birthday. And the fact of the matter is that he was born in 1920, and at that time, the Japanese government required the Issei to register all their children's birth and report it to the consulate in San Francisco, which would transfer that information to their home village and write it on the family register. But that law was changed in 1924, 4 years later, when he was 4 years old. So he became a Japanese citizen for 4 years, okay? Not even knowing it. But because he was a Japanese citizen, and then now is an American citizen, he became eligible for this award. And he was very proud when he received it. And the consul general, who actually came to our dedication ceremony, his predecessor, sent his black limousine. He did all the way to Woodland, where I live, and delivered this certificate. Okay. Now, the consul general himself did not come down, or any of his deputies, but his driver came down and did all the little bowing and everything and handed it to me on my porch. So even that was a very special thing. It was a nice gesture. I'm pretty sure that very few people in Northern California received that 100-year award that year, because you would have had to have been in my father's situation and being born before 1924. Fortunately, my father had a son who went to law school, so I did some research and I convinced the consulate that he was eligible for this, and even had to educate the consulate on how the Japanese law was in 1920 and how it changed in 1924. They had to go back to Tokyo to confirm what I was saying was right. But anyway, this exhibit, really did cover 100 years, from 1888, when the first Japanese student came out to pick some apricots for the Brink brothers, all the way till 1988, when another member of the Japanese community, myself, helped Ronald Reagan in Congress pass the redress legislation. And I would say that most people think Winters is a small, sleepy little town and nothing significant happens here. But in Japanese American history, I think it really is historically one of the most significant little towns in the United States. And I'm very proud to have been born in Winters. I grew up next to the Brink family and the Thistle family, and didn't realize their historic significance until maybe about 10 years ago. So sometimes I think that maybe I was destined to do something like this. And actually, if I had known it, it would have felt like it was a burden, but I did it and then found out later on exactly what all the circumstances were. So that's kind of my story, and I'm very happy for the Winters Museum for helping us put this exhibit together. I really think we have very special people here in Winters, and many of the people on the Winters board now are classmates, And, when you go to Winters, a lot of the kids that you're in kindergarten with, you graduate from high school from like 12 or 13 years later. So, you know, you're almost all like cousins by the time you graduate. You know, not all of them are as nice as you want them to be or as mean as you think they are. But, you know, if they're cousins, then it's all in the family. So I hope this gives you some insight into what we're trying to do here. And I want to thank the current mayor, Piazzi, and his city council for authorizing the placement of the monument. I think that was a nice gesture, and I was really amazed at the turnout, both from the ancestors, Japanese ancestors, as well as the community, many of whom are really the longtime heart of the community. So thank you very much.